The first time I heard about the house, it wasn't from a headline or a rumor. It was from a friend who spoke in a voice so quiet I had to lean in closer, like the words might shatter if they hit the air too hard. "They're not just sad," she said. "They're scared." That's how it started for me, an ordinary sentence, spoken by someone who had no reason to exaggerate, and yet it sounded like a warning. The house was famous, not because of its architecture or its address, but because it belonged to a family that lived in the public eye for decades. And still, behind the fame, there was a private world no one was allowed to see. When you grow up watching someone on a screen, you begin to believe you know them. You think you understand their voice, their jokes, their pain. You don't realize how easy it is to mistake performance for reality. The public face becomes a mask so convincing that even the people closest to it forget there's a person underneath. That's the danger of celebrity, when the world becomes the stage, and the stage becomes the only safe place to be. The house was not the kind of place you could just walk into. It didn't have a welcome feeling. It felt sealed, like a shell that had hardened over time. The blinds were always drawn. The lights were always dim. Even the garden looked like it had stopped growing on purpose. When my friend described it, she said it was as if the home itself was trying to protect the people inside from something it couldn't name. The word she used was fortress. And I couldn't stop thinking about what kind of fear makes a person build a fortress inside their own life. People assume fear has a sound, a scream, a crash, a slam. But fear can also be quiet. It can live in the small things, like a locked door in a home where no one should feel threatened. It can live in the way someone checks their phone every 2 minutes, as if the device is a pulse monitor that tells them whether the world is still safe. It can live in the way a person refuses invitations, even from those who love them. They don't say no because they're busy. They say no because being seen feels dangerous. I met someone once who worked on that show, long before it became a legend. She wasn't a star. She was the kind of person who stayed in the background, the kind of person people only remember when they're trying to prove a point. She had a calm face and a gentle voice, but when she spoke about the family, her eyes changed. They became raw. It wasn't sadness. It was something heavier, like grief that had been stored for years and was finally running out of room. She told me that the family was always funny on set, always quick with a joke, always making everyone feel safe. But she also told me that the laughter had always been a thin layer, like frosting on a cake that was cracked underneath. The show itself was about family, but it was also a kind of mirror. It reflected a certain kind of American home, one filled with love and tension, humor and resentment, pride and fear. The cast became a real family in a way few people understand. They spent years together. They shared holidays. They shared secrets. They shared the kind of intimacy that makes you believe you can read a person's heart just by looking at them. But even the closest people can miss what's happening behind closed doors. And that's what this story is really about. The things we miss because we want to believe the story we've been told. The things we ignore because we don't want to see the person we love as someone who could be hurt or could hurt others. There's a moment in every story where the first crack appears. It doesn't look like much at the time. It's a small, almost invisible fracture that no one notices until it becomes a break. In this case, the crack appeared in the way the father began to withdraw, not dramatically, not with a grand announcement, just slowly. He stopped returning calls. He stopped attending dinners. He stopped making jokes. The person who used to be the center of every room started becoming a shadow. The friend I mentioned earlier, she wasn't trying to paint a picture of tragedy. She was simply describing what she saw. She said he looked smaller, like someone had taken away the part of him that belonged to the world. She described a man who used to walk into a room and fill it with light, now entering like someone trying not to be noticed. She said his smile began to look forced, like it belonged to a character he was playing. And she said, quietly, he was afraid. The thing about fear is that it can make even the strongest person feel powerless. The father in this story was not a weak man. He was someone who had built a career out of confidence and control. He was a person who knew how to lead, how to command, how to speak in a way that made people listen. But fear doesn't care about talent or success. Fear cares about survival. And survival is not always about physical danger. Sometimes it's about emotional collapse. Sometimes it's about a person being crushed slowly by a force they can't name. Sometimes it's about a parent realizing that the person they raised is no longer the child they thought they knew. The family's son was not a public figure. He didn't seek the spotlight. He wasn't on stage, but his presence was felt in every room that knew the family. People talked about him the way people talk about a storm that's been predicted for years. They spoke in hushed tones. They used phrases like struggles and issues and help. They said he was talented, brilliant, troubled, unpredictable. They said he was a person who could be loving one moment and terrifying the next. And that's the cruel thing about mental illness and addiction. It can make someone feel like they're two different people. One version of them is the person you love. The other version is the person you fear. The loved one becomes the stranger. The stranger becomes the one who controls your life. I heard that the father tried everything. He tried therapy. He tried treatment. He tried love. He tried patience. He tried ignoring the warning signs. He tried believing that time would fix it. But the truth is, time doesn't fix things when the problem is not time, it's control. The son's behavior wasn't just hard. It was consuming. It demanded attention, money, energy, forgiveness. It demanded a constant state of vigilance. It turned the home into a place where everyone was waiting for the next explosion. And waiting, day after day, becomes its own kind of torture. People often say, why didn't they just leave? As if it's simple, as if love is a switch, as if a parent can just abandon their child when the child becomes dangerous. But love is not a rational force. Love is a chain. And when you're chained to someone you fear, the fear doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. One of the most painful parts of this story is how the family tried to protect themselves from the world. They didn't want their private life to become a spectacle. They didn't want to be judged. They didn't want their child's pain to become a headline. So they built walls. They created an image. They kept their doors closed. They made it look like everything was fine. But the truth is, you can't protect a person from the world if the danger is inside your own home. You can't keep a secret forever. And you can't pretend that fear doesn't exist simply because you don't want to admit it. I spoke to someone who knew the father during the later years, when the distance between him and his friends had become noticeable. This person described the father as quietly desperate. Not dramatic, not loud, just desperate. He was the kind of desperation that doesn't look like desperation until it's too late. It's the kind of desperation that shows up in small moments, like refusing to answer the phone, or canceling plans, or staring out the window for hours. The friend said, he was trying to keep the family from falling apart, but he didn't know how. That sentence stayed with me, because it's not just a description of a man. It's a description of a family. It's the story of a parent trying to hold the pieces together while the pieces keep breaking. And it's the story of a person realizing, slowly, that love is not enough. Love is not a cure. Love is not a shield. Love is not a law. Love is a force that can lift you up or drag you down depending on what it's attached to. There was a moment, years before everything unraveled, when the father made a decision that seemed like hope. A close friend told me he tried to seek help in a way that didn't involve shame. He didn't want to call the world's attention to his family. He didn't want to be judged, so he tried to handle it privately. He spoke to doctors. He spoke to counselors. He tried to find a treatment plan that would work without exposing his child to public scrutiny. But privacy can become a prison when the problem is too large. The family was trapped between two forces, the desire to protect their child's dignity and the need to protect themselves from harm. The more they tried to keep things quiet, the more the situation grew. It's a paradox that makes no sense until you're inside it. The father was not naive. He knew what could happen. He knew the risks, but he was also a parent. And parents are often willing to sacrifice everything for their children, even when the child is the source of the danger. That's what makes the story so heartbreaking. It's not just a tale of tragedy. It's a tale of love that becomes destructive because it refuses to let go. People in the family's circle notice changes, not dramatic ones, but the kind that add up. The father's humor began to feel strained. The mother's eyes began to look tired. The family gatherings became tense, like everyone was waiting for a storm that never arrived, but always threatened to. It's easy to judge from the outside. It's easy to say, they should have done this. It's easy to pretend you know the right answer. But when you're living inside fear, the right answer is never clear. One of the most haunting things about this story is the way people in the family tried to pretend everything was normal. Not because they were lying, but because they were surviving. Normalcy is a coping mechanism. It's a way of keeping the world from noticing that the house is on fire. The father who once seemed invincible began to retreat. He stopped inviting people over. He stopped going out. He stopped attending events. The friend I spoke with said he began to feel like a man living in a story that had already ended. That's the kind of sadness that doesn't make noise. It's a quiet collapse. The mother, on the other hand, became the silent anchor. She tried to keep things stable. She tried to keep the home from turning into a battleground. She tried to keep the family together, even when the pieces were slipping. People who knew her described her as strong, but not in the way people usually mean. Not loud, not powerful, just enduring. She began locking her door at night, not because of strangers, not because of burglars, because she was afraid of the person she loved. She was afraid of the child she raised. The idea of that is almost unbearable. It's a kind of pain that doesn't fit into any narrative. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't have a clear villain. It just exists quietly in the corners of a home. And that's the thing about fear. It changes the meaning of ordinary actions. A locked door becomes a symbol of terror. A closed blind becomes a sign of isolation. A silent phone becomes a threat. The father was known for his voice, his ability to speak, to command, to persuade. But in the last years, his voice became smaller. People who worked with him noticed it. They said he sounded tired, like his words had to climb uphill just to reach the surface. He was still brilliant, he was still talented, but the joy had faded. A person I spoke to who worked in the industry said the father had begun to avoid the very things that once energized him. He stopped taking roles. He stopped attending events. He stopped meeting with people he trusted. It wasn't that he didn't want to work. It was that the world had become too loud. The world had become too intrusive. The world had become too uncertain. The friend told me that the father began to live in a state of constant anticipation, as if he was waiting for something to happen. He would check his phone repeatedly. He would become anxious when it buzzed. He would stare at it as if it held the answer to a question he didn't know how to ask. It's the kind of anxiety that doesn't go away. It doesn't get better with time. It just becomes part of your daily rhythm. It becomes your default state. And eventually, it begins to shape your identity. The father began to look like someone who had been carrying a heavy burden for so long that his shoulders had curved under the weight. He looked like someone who had forgotten how to breathe. There was a lunch. It was ordinary in every way except for the fact that it became a turning point. The friend I spoke with said it was one of the last times she saw the father in person. They met in a quiet restaurant, a place that didn't attract attention. They talked about the past. They laughed. They reminisced. But beneath the laughter was a tension she couldn't ignore. The father kept checking his phone. He kept flinching at every notification. He looked like someone who expected bad news at any moment. When she asked him if everything was okay, he didn't answer directly. He didn't say, "I'm fine." He didn't say, "Nothing's wrong." He said something that haunted her. "I don't know how to stop him." Not, "I don't know how to help him." Not, "I don't know how to save him." But, "I don't know how to stop him." That phrase has a weight to it that doesn't belong in a normal conversation. It's the language of someone who feels powerless. It's the language of someone who has tried everything and still failed. She didn't understand what he meant at the time. She assumed he was talking about industry pressures or politics or some external force. But later, when she heard similar stories from others, the meaning became clearer. It wasn't about the world. It was about his own home. And that's the terrifying part. The idea that the person you love can become a force you can't control. The son's behavior had become unpredictable. People who knew him described moments of warmth followed by sudden anger. They described moments of clarity followed by confusion. They described a person who could be charming and frightening in the same breath. It's a condition that makes people around you feel like they're walking on eggshells. The father tried to protect his child. He tried to shield him from consequences. He tried to buy time, believing that love would eventually be enough. But the truth is, consequences are part of reality. Consequences are what keep us anchored. When a person avoids consequences, they begin to believe they are above the world. They begin to believe they can do anything. And that belief becomes dangerous when the person is unstable. People around the family began to notice a pattern. The son would disappear for a while, then reappear with a new promise. He would apologize. He would promise to change. He would talk about getting help. And for a moment, the family would breathe. Then the pattern would repeat. It's a cycle that destroys families quietly. It's a cycle that erodes trust. It's a cycle that makes people feel like they're constantly being manipulated. And the worst part is, the manipulation often comes from a place of pain. The son wasn't just acting out, he was suffering, and the family was suffering with him. The father's friends tried to help. Some offered money, some offered support, some offered solutions. But the father was trapped between two forces, his love for his son and his fear of his son. People close to him said he was beginning to look like someone who had been forced to choose between two impossible options. There was one friend, a person known for being calm and decisive, who tried to intervene. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to embarrass anyone. He just wanted to help. He visited the family under the pretense of discussing a project. But what he found was not a normal family meeting. He found tension. He found chaos. He found a household on the edge of collapse. He saw the son arguing with the mother. He saw the son demanding money. He saw the mother trying to calm him. He saw the father trying to keep the peace. And he realized that the situation was beyond what any of them could handle alone. He pulled the father aside and spoke to him with blunt honesty. He told him the home was not safe. He told him he needed to remove his son or leave. He didn't say it as a threat. He said it as a warning. The father's response was what you would expect from a parent. He said, "He's sick. We can't abandon him." He said it not as an excuse, but as a truth. He said it like a prayer. And that is the moment where love becomes both the source of strength and the source of destruction. The father tried to hold on. He tried to keep the family together. But the more he held on, the more he felt himself slipping. He began to withdraw from people who loved him. He began to cancel plans. He began to avoid reunions. He began to isolate. His friends noticed. They felt hurt. They felt confused. They felt like they were being shut out. But they didn't know what was happening inside the house. They didn't know the fear that had begun to live there. The mother became the one who held everything together. She became the mediator. She became the peacekeeper. She became the person who tried to keep the son from becoming violent. She became the person who tried to keep the father from falling apart. But peacekeeping is a form of sacrifice. It's a kind of labor that no one sees. It's a kind of strength that doesn't get praised. It's a kind of love that goes unnoticed until it's gone. The mother began to sleep with her door locked. She did it quietly, without telling anyone. She did it because she was afraid. She did it because the fear had become too big to ignore. She did it because she couldn't bear the thought of waking up to something she couldn't control. And that's when the home stopped feeling like a home. It became a place of survival. People who knew the family began to talk in whispers. They spoke about the son's behavior. They spoke about the father's exhaustion. They spoke about the mother's fear. They spoke about the locked door. They spoke about the closed blinds. But they didn't speak loudly. They didn't want to become part of the story. They didn't want to be blamed. They didn't want to be seen as the ones who didn't help. The father's friends began to feel guilty. They began to wonder if they should have pushed harder. They began to wonder if they should have intervened sooner. They began to wonder if they should have insisted on a different solution. But guilt is a heavy thing. It's a thing that grows in the dark. It's a thing that makes you look back at the past and imagine all the ways you could have changed it. The truth is, no one knew what to do. The father didn't want to expose his child. The child didn't want help. The mother was trapped. The friends were powerless. The system was failing. And the world kept moving. People went to work. People watched television. People laughed. People loved. The tragedy was happening inside a home that the world couldn't see. The father began to sell assets quietly, not because he wanted to live lavishly, not because he was reckless, not because he was reckless. He did it because he was trying to pay off debts that had accumulated from trying to protect his child. He didn't want anyone to know. He didn't want anyone to judge him. He didn't want anyone to think his family was falling apart. But the truth is, money can't buy safety. Money can't buy peace. Money can't buy control. The father's financial desperation became another layer of fear. He was not only afraid of his son's behavior, but also of what that behavior was costing him. He was afraid of losing everything he had worked for. He was afraid of being seen as a failure. The father's friends didn't know. They thought he was simply choosing to live a quieter life. They thought he was aging. They thought he was retiring. But the father was not retiring. He was surviving. And survival can become a lonely path. There was an incident 6 months before the final collapse that still haunts those who knew the family. The father fell down the stairs. The story was simple: an accident, a slip, a broken wrist, bruising on the face. It was accepted. No one questioned it. But the friend who visited him in the hospital couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. The bruising didn't look like a fall. The father's eyes didn't look like someone who had simply slipped. He looked like someone who had been broken in a way that wasn't physical. She asked him directly what happened. She didn't accuse, she didn't shout, she simply asked. And he didn't answer. He looked away, he cried. Silence is a kind of truth. Sometimes it's louder than words. Sometimes it's the only answer a person can give when the truth is too painful to speak. The friend left the hospital feeling unsettled. She couldn't explain why. She couldn't prove anything. But she couldn't ignore the feeling either. And that's the thing about fear. It makes you question everything, even when you don't want to. The father's friends began to notice that he was becoming more distant. He wasn't just canceling plans. He was avoiding people entirely. He was becoming a man who existed in his own world, a world that was built on fear and love and denial. They tried to reach him. They tried to call him. They tried to invite him, but he never responded. It was as if he had disappeared. The mother was still there, holding the home together, but she was becoming exhausted. She was becoming smaller. She was becoming a person who existed only to protect the family from itself. The son's behavior became more erratic. People around him began to feel a sense of dread. They began to sense that something was coming, something inevitable, something that couldn't be stopped. And in the midst of it all, the father continued to believe that love was enough. Love is powerful. Love is beautiful. Love can heal. But love can also blind you. Love can make you believe that the person you love is untouchable. Love can make you believe that the person you love will change. Love can make you believe that the person you love is still the child you raised. And sometimes, love is not enough to save you from the person you love. The father began to withdraw even more. The home became quieter. The blinds remained closed. The doors remained locked. The house became a place of silence. People who passed by the home described it as sealed, not abandoned, not empty, just sealed, as if the house itself was trying to hold something inside. The friend who knew the father said she once drove by the house just to check. She didn't want to intrude. She just wanted to see if he was okay. She saw the closed blinds, the silence, the feeling of a home that had become a fortress. She texted him to say she was nearby. Hours passed before he replied. His message was short. Not a good time. That phrase in another context would mean nothing. But in this context, it sounded like a warning. It sounded like a door being shut. It sounded like a person who was too tired to explain. And it sounded like someone who was afraid of what was happening inside his own home. The father's friends began to feel helpless. They began to realize that their love and concern were not enough. They began to understand that the situation had become bigger than any one person. They began to wonder if there were signs they missed. They began to wonder if there were ways they could have helped. They began to wonder if they could have done something differently. But the truth is, the father was not the only one who was trying to protect his child. The mother was also trying. The friends were also trying. The system was failing. The world was ignoring. And the son was suffering. It's easy to think of this story as a tragedy with a single cause. But it's not. It's a tragedy with many causes. It's a tragedy of love. It's a tragedy of denial. It's a tragedy of a system that doesn't know how to handle the most vulnerable among us. It's a tragedy of a family trying to survive in a world that doesn't understand them. The father's friends began to talk about intervention. They began to talk about treatment. They began to talk about solutions. But the son refused. He refused to go away. He refused to accept help. He refused to leave the home that had become a battleground. The father didn't force him, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. He couldn't bear the thought of sending his child away. He couldn't bear the thought of being the parent who abandoned his own child. The friend who visited the home said the father seemed trapped in a cycle of hope and fear. He hoped his son would change. He feared his son would not. He hoped the situation would improve. He feared it would worsen. And the more the father hoped, the more he denied the reality. Denial is a form of protection. It's a way of keeping the mind from breaking. But denial also prevents action. Denial keeps people stuck. Denial keeps people from seeing the truth. And sometimes, the truth is the only thing that can save you. The son's behavior continued to escalate. People around him began to feel a sense of dread. They began to sense that something was coming, something that could not be stopped. The father's friends began to fear for him. They began to fear for the mother. They began to fear for the son. They began to fear for the family. The father's love for his child was not a weakness. It was a strength. But it was also a vulnerability, because love can make you blind. Love can make you forgiving. Love can make you hopeful. Love can make you believe that the person you love will never hurt you. And when the person you love is the one who hurts you, the pain is unbearable. The family's story became a quiet nightmare. It was not a headline. It was not a scandal. It was not a spectacle. It was a tragedy happening in a home that the world could not see. And that's what makes it so haunting. There was a moment, shortly before the final collapse, when the father realized that the situation was beyond his control. He began to understand that love was not enough. He began to understand that he could not save his child alone. He began to look for help. He began to reach out. He began to accept that the world might see his family's pain. But the world is not always kind to pain. The world is not always understanding. The world is not always compassionate. The world is often judgmental. The world is often cruel. And the father was afraid. He was afraid of being judged. He was afraid of being blamed. He was afraid of being seen as a failure. He was afraid of losing everything he had built. So he tried to keep the pain hidden. He tried to keep the fear inside. He tried to keep the family together. But the fear kept growing. And the house became more and more like a fortress. The final days were not dramatic. They were not cinematic. They were not the kind of moment you could easily turn into a story. They were quiet. They were ordinary. They were filled with small actions that, in hindsight, felt like warnings. Neighbors described tension. They described silence. They described a home that seemed closed off from the world. They described a family that had stopped existing in the way it once did. The father's friends described a man who had become exhausted. They described a man who had lost the joy that once defined him. They described a man who had become a stranger to himself. The mother's friends described a woman who had become small. They described a woman who had become afraid of her own home. They described a woman who had become trapped by love. And the son's friends described a man who was lost. They described a man who was suffering. They described a man who was spiraling. It's easy to look back and see the signs. It's easy to say what should have been done. But in the moment, it was just a family trying to survive. When the tragedy finally happened, it wasn't a single moment. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was the result of a long, slow collapse. It was the result of years of fear, denial, love, and exhaustion. It was the result of a family trying to hold together a life that had become too heavy to carry. People asked questions. People searched for answers. People looked for someone to blame. They wanted a clear villain. They wanted a clear motive. They wanted a clear explanation. But life is not always like that. Life is messy. Life is complicated. Life is full of love and pain and contradictions. The father's friends were left with guilt. The mother's friends were left with grief. The son's friends were left with confusion. And the world was left with a story that didn't fit into any simple narrative. In the aftermath, the father's friends spoke in whispers again. They spoke about the signs they missed. They spoke about the love that became destructive. They spoke about the fear that lived in a home where no one should feel unsafe. They spoke about the locked door. They spoke about the closed blinds. They spoke about the quiet phone. They spoke about the sense that something was wrong for a long time. And they spoke about the hardest truth of all, that the family had been suffering in silence for years. The tragedy wasn't just the final moment. The tragedy was the entire story leading up to it. The tragedy was the years of fear. The tragedy was the years of denial. The tragedy was the years of love that couldn't save anyone. And the tragedy was that the world only saw the end, not the long, painful journey that led there. When I think about the family, I don't think about fame. I don't think about the public image. I think about a father who loved his child so fiercely that he couldn't let go. I think about a mother who became a protector in a home that no longer felt safe. I think about a son who was lost inside his own mind. I think about the locked door. I think about the closed blinds. I think about the silence that grew heavier every day. I think about the way fear can live in a home without anyone knowing. And I think about the way we, as a society, treat those who are struggling. We talk about mental illness like it's a story. We talk about addiction like it's a choice. We talk about family tragedy like it's entertainment. But this wasn't entertainment. This was real life. This was a family trying to survive in a world that didn't know how to help them. The house with the locked doors is not just a place. It's a symbol of a truth we often refuse to face, that love is not always enough, and that sometimes the most dangerous things are the ones we keep hidden inside our own homes. And when the doors finally open, the world is left with the aftermath of a pain that should have been seen sooner.